For years, those discharges out of Lake Okeechobee have poisoned our beaches, killed fish, and cost Florida millions in lost tourism.
But let's take a closer look at the green, blue algae and the colors on this satellite. They represent different levels of algae on the lake. If we could pull that up.
There is a lake in the middle of Florida, so big that you cannot see across it. Stand on the southern shore and look north, and all you get is water, sky, and the flat shimmer of heat rising off the surface. It covers 730 square miles. It is the largest freshwater lake in the state and the second largest contained entirely within the lower 48. The Seminole called it Okeechobee, big water. And for most of the last century, satellites orbiting hundreds of miles overhead have quietly recorded something that almost nobody on the ground ever thinks about. What happens when this lake breathes out? Every so often, when the water inside it rises too high, engineers open the gates. Billions of gallons pour east toward the Atlantic and west toward the Gulf. And when that happens, the color of the water changes so dramatically that you can watch it from space. Turquoise sliding into brown, brown sliding into black. This is not a rumor or a leaked anomaly. It is a documented, recurring event, and understanding why it keeps happening means understanding what this lake has been quietly storing for the better part of 100 years. To understand the lake, you first have to understand the wall around it. Lake Okeechobee is remarkably shallow for its size, on average only about 9 feet deep. In some stretches, you could wade out for the length of several football fields before the water reached your waist. That shallowness made it lethal during hurricanes. On September 16, 1928, a Category 5 storm crossed directly over the lake. There was no containment system at the time. Only low-lying farmland worked mostly by black migrant laborers, harvesting beans, sugarcane, and vegetables in the rich muck soil at the lake's edge. The hurricane's winds pushed the lake's water against its southern rim until the natural banks gave way. A wall of water swept across the farmland in the dark. The official death toll was set at 2,500 people. Historians who have gone back through the records since believe the real number was higher, possibly over 3,000, because so many of the victims, mostly black agricultural workers, were buried in mass graves or never formally counted at all. At the time, it stood as the second deadliest natural disaster in American history, and it was almost entirely preventable. In its aftermath, the federal government ordered a permanent fix. The Army Corps of Engineers began building the Herbert Hoover Dike, a 143-mile earthen levee designed to completely encircle the lake. By the 1960s, the job was finished. Okeechobee was no longer a lake in the natural sense. It was a reservoir, contained on every side, with water allowed to leave only through engineered outlets, canals and spillways tightly scheduled by the Corps. The wall worked. It also created a problem nobody fully reckoned with at the time. Before the dike, Okeechobee's water moved south naturally into the Everglades, filtering slowly through hundreds of miles of sawgrass marsh, the river of grass that had existed for thousands of years and functioned, essentially, as a giant biological filter. The dike severed that connection. The land between the lake and the remaining wetlands was converted into the Everglades agricultural area. Hundreds of thousands of acres of sugarcane, vegetables, and cattle ranching that today make up one of the most productive farm belts in the country, and one of the most politically powerful agricultural industries in the state. Farming at that scale runs on fertilizer, and fertilizer means phosphorus. For 7 decades, runoff carrying phosphorus and nitrogen has drained off those farms and into the lake. Because Okeechobee no longer flushes south the way it used to, it behaves instead like a settling pond. The nutrient-laden particles sink and accumulate in the mud at the bottom. By the 1990s, state scientists were already warning that the lake's sediment held a massive buried reserve of what researchers call legacy phosphorus, decades of agricultural history sitting quietly on the lakebed, inert as long as nothing disturbs it. That is the part almost nobody outside water management circles understands. The lake's danger isn't only what flows in today. It's what has been sitting at the bottom since before most of us were born. Because the dike prevents the lake from overflowing, water managers are boxed into a narrow operating range, too high, and the aging levee is put under dangerous structural stress. Too low, and the lake's own ecology, Its grass beds, its fish, its wildlife starts to collapse. When the water rises past a safe threshold, the Army Corps has essentially two release valves: east, down the St. Lucie Canal toward the Atlantic and the Indian River Lagoon, or west, down the Caloosahatchee River toward the Gulf and the waters around Sanibel and Captiva. Every major release in modern Okeechobee history has gone one of those two ways, and both routes carry the same unwanted cargo, fresh, nutrient-heavy water, into estuaries that were never built to absorb it. The consequences of those releases are not hypothetical. They're on the historical record. In 2016, discharges toward the Treasure Coast triggered one of the worst algae outbreaks in Florida history, with thick blue-green cyanobacteria coating canals and the St. Lucie River, prompting a state of emergency and gutting a tourist season. In 2018, a red tide bloom along the Gulf Coast, fed in part by nutrients delivered from the lake, killed marine life by the ton, from fish to manatees to sea turtles, and cost Lee County alone well over $100 million in tourism losses. These aren't one-off disasters. They are the predictable result of a system built to protect people from flooding that never accounted for what would happen to everything downstream once the lake started acting as a chemical reservoir instead of a living one. Which brings us to the release that actually happened in December 2024, a real documented operation, not folklore. With the lake sitting at 16 feet, well above target levels after a wet hurricane season, the Army Corps' Jacksonville district began what they called Lake Okeechobee recovery operations. Starting December 7th, both spillways were opened at once, sending more than 1 billion gallons of water a day down each river, the St. Lucie to the east, the Caloosahatchee to the west, every day for months, with a stated goal of bringing the lake down from 16 feet to somewhere between 11.5 and 12 feet in order to save dying underwater grasses that the high water had smothered. It was one of the largest simultaneous dual-coast releases in the lake's modern operating history, and it was covered locally by Florida outlets and clean water advocacy groups who had warned for months that opening both gates at once, at that volume, for that long, risked exactly the kind of downstream damage the lake had produced before. The Corps also issued something unusual, a boater's advisory. Officials warned that the discharges were creating dangerous turbulence and shifting currents around the locks on both sides of the lake, strong enough to pull vessels toward the spillways or slam them against the gates on approach. It was reportedly the first time the Corps had needed to issue that kind of warning for the Okeechobee waterway. That detail alone tells you something about the scale of what was moving through those canals, not metaphorical turbulence, but literal, physical force strong enough to threaten boats. Downstream, the pattern that has played out after nearly every major release repeated itself. Water clarity dropped as the plume moved toward the coasts. Environmental groups on both sides of the state vote water on the Treasure Coast, the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation on the Gulf side, raised alarms about the volume and duration of the discharge, worried it would undo years of slow seagrass recovery in the Indian River Lagoon and reignite red tide conditions that had only just begun to ease. City officials in Stewart, on the St. Lucie River, publicly objected to the timing and scale of the release before it even began, warning it would kill oysters and seagrass at a fragile stage of recovery. Here is the uncomfortable truth underneath all of it. There is no clean answer to what the Army Corps is being asked to do. Keep the lake high, and the aging dike is put at structural risk during the next major storm. An actual public safety concern, not a hypothetical one, given what happened in 1928. Lower the lake, and the water has to go somewhere, carrying decades of stored nutrients into estuaries that cannot process them without triggering algae blooms and fish kills. Send it south into the Everglades instead, and the remaining wetlands take on pollution loads they were never designed to filter. There is no version of managing Okeechobee that doesn't involve trading one kind of damage for another. Every choice the Corps makes is, by definition, the least bad option, not a good one. There has been an attempt at a real fix. The Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, authorized in 2000, is a multi-billion-dollar federal-state effort to rebuild reservoirs and treatment marshes that would let excess lake water be stored and cleaned before it's ever discharged, instead of dumped straight into the rivers. It is real, it is funded, and pieces of it are under construction right now. It is also decades behind its original schedule, slowed by cost overruns, land acquisition fights, and the sheer scale of re-engineering a water system that spans the entire southern half of the state. Until those reservoirs are finished, the lake has nowhere else to put its excess water except east or west, straight into the same estuaries that have already been hurt by this cycle for the better part of 30 years. None of this is unique to Florida, either. Any lake or reservoir that has spent decades absorbing agricultural runoff is sitting on a version of the same buried inventory. Sections of the Great Lakes carry a century of industrial and agricultural legacy pollution in their sediment. The Chesapeake Bay has struggled for decades with nutrient-driven dead zones. The Mississippi River carries runoff from across the entire Midwest into the Gulf of Mexico, feeding a hypoxic zone that reliably reappears every summer, roughly the size of a small state. Warmer water holds less oxygen. Heavier rainfall stirs sediment more violently. What Okeechobee goes through with almost predictable regularity is a preview of a stress that is going to show up in more American waterways as the climate keeps shifting, not less. So the honest, unglamorous answer to can this be fixed is not quickly and not by any single decision. The phosphorus already sitting in Okeechobee's mud cannot be vacuumed out at any meaningful scale with current technology. It can only be managed around, carefully, slowly, and expensively, while restoration infrastructure that should have been finished years ago continues to be built. Lake Okeechobee is still the beating heart of South Florida's water system. It still supplies drinking water to millions of people. It is still boxed in by a levee built to stop a disaster that already happened once. And every time the water inside it needs to move, it carries a little more of the last 100 years with it, out toward whichever coast happens to be downstream. If you live near either coast, or you've ever wondered what's actually inside the water when it turns that unfamiliar shade of brown after a big release, that's it. Not a mystery pulled from the lakebed by accident, but the predictable cost of a century-old engineering decision that solved one emergency and quietly created another.